"You're worth more than this," he said, his voice a whisper in the vast room. Charlotte Bennet's heart raced as she stood at the grand entrance, every gaze in the room fixed on her. She had always known this moment would come, but she hadn't prepared for it to feel so real. The weight of her father's debts had crushed her, and now, she was nothing more than a pawn in a ruthless game. The grand ballroom, shimmering with gold and crystal, felt suffocating as the guests murmured about the young woman who had been sold to the highest bidder. Her father's actions had trapped her in a life she didn't choose, but it wasn't the gilded cage that stung. It was the realization that she was nothing more than an object. She had been sold as a lady's companion, meant to please, to serve, but never to live. And as the eyes of the aristocracy scanned her with cold curiosity, Charlotte felt the sting of humiliation deep in her chest. She had been sold to Duke Alexander Westbrook, the most powerful man in the room. She had no idea what he wanted from her, but she knew one thing. She was his now. As the Duke's cold eyes met hers across the room, something inside her twisted. He was tall, imposing, his dark eyes calculating yet unreadable. The whispers around her grew louder, but she could barely hear them over the thumping of her heart. With each step he took toward her, her breath grew shallow. This wasn't a man who looked at her with kindness. He looked at her like a transaction. A deal to be made, not a life to be saved. He stopped before her, his presence overwhelming. "Miss Bennet," his voice was low, filled with authority. "I trust you're comfortable?" His words were laced with an edge that sent a shiver down her spine. Charlotte forced herself to meet his gaze, though her body trembled. She nodded, though nothing about this situation felt comfortable. "You don't have to pretend," he continued, his tone softer now, though still with that hint of command. "You're not just another guest here. You're here because of your father's debts, but you are not alone in this. I will ensure you are treated with respect." She wanted to laugh, to scream, but instead, she swallowed the lump in her throat. He was offering her respect, but in return, she would have to become something she never wanted to be. She had no choice. But as his eyes lingered on her, Charlotte couldn't help but wonder if, perhaps, this Duke was more than the cold, distant man she thought him to be. Perhaps there was a spark of something deeper behind those eyes, something that would set her free. The room seemed to close in around her as she realized that she had just stepped into a world where she no longer had control. But maybe, just maybe, the Duke would give her the one thing she hadn't had in years, freedom. Charlotte stood there, frozen in the Duke's presence. His gaze, sharp and calculating, seemed to strip away her last vestige of pride. She had spent her life serving others, but this felt different. Duke Alexander Westbrook wasn't looking at her as if she were just another servant or pawn in a game. He was looking at her as though he could see right through her. His presence was like a force, unyielding and cold, and yet, there was something beneath it, something she couldn't quite grasp. "You're not what I expected," he said, his voice low, almost thoughtful. Charlotte didn't respond. There was nothing to say. How could she explain the turmoil that raged inside her? She had been sold to him, a mere object for his use. Yet, as she stood there, waiting for him to speak again, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Hope that had been buried deep inside her for years. The Duke's eyes softened, just slightly, but it was enough for Charlotte to notice. "I don't know what game your father is playing," he continued, his voice still steady, "but I will ensure you're treated better than this." She blinked, not sure if she had heard him right. Better than this? She had been nothing more than a bargaining chip in a world that had always seen her as less. The Duke stepped closer, and Charlotte's breath caught. She wanted to step back, to distance herself, but something about his presence held her in place. He wasn't just the Duke, the man who held power over her life. He was someone who could change everything. "I will take care of you, Miss Bennet," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I don't know why your father made this arrangement, but I will make sure you're treated with the respect you deserve." His words were like a lifeline, something she had been starving for. But could she trust him? Could she really believe that someone like him, a man of power, of cold authority, would ever see her as more than a mere accessory? "And what do you expect in return?" Charlotte's voice came out before she could stop it. It wasn't a question she had intended to ask, but it had slipped out, the fear and uncertainty in her heart seeping into her words. The Duke looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Nothing," he said simply. "I don't expect anything in return. I will do this because it is right, not because I want something from you. The simplicity of his statement left her speechless. Could it really be that simple? Could she trust him? She had spent years learning to trust no one, to rely only on herself. But in that moment, with the Duke standing before her, a part of her began to wonder if she had been wrong all along. Perhaps there was more to him than the cold, distant man she had heard about in whispered rumors. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a chance for her to find something she had long given up on, freedom. For the first time in years, Charlotte allowed herself to hope, even if just for a moment. The Duke's words had ignited a spark in her that she couldn't ignore. She had no idea what the future would hold, but for the first time, she felt like she had a chance to take control of her own life. Charlotte had spent the next few days in a daze. The Duke's words replayed in her mind, a steady rhythm that brought both comfort and confusion. She had expected to be nothing more than a pawn in this world, but his actions, his kindness, left her questioning everything she had known about power, control, and the men who wielded them. But the question remained, why was he doing this? Why was he offering her something no one else had ever given her? Respect? It was a rainy afternoon when Charlotte found herself standing in the Duke's study. She hadn't been invited. She simply wandered in, her curiosity driving her more than her sense of propriety. She had never been allowed in this part of the house before, and yet, here she was, standing in the room of a man who held her future in his hands. She could hear the faint rustling of papers as Duke Alexander sat at his desk, his focus on his work. The warmth of the fire flickered softly in the corner of the room, casting long shadows across the walls. He didn't notice her at first, too lost in his thoughts, and she didn't know what to do. Should she leave? Should she wait for him to acknowledge her? The silence between them grew heavy, and then, as though sensing her presence, he looked up, his piercing gaze locked with hers, and for a moment, neither of them moved. "Miss Bennet," he said softly, his voice breaking the stillness of the room. "I didn't expect to see you here." Charlotte swallowed, unsure of how to respond. She had never been invited into this space, but she felt a strange pull toward him, a pull she couldn't explain. I just wanted to see you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The Duke raised an eyebrow, the corner of his lips twitching ever so slightly. "You wanted to see me?" he repeated, as if the notion was foreign to him. Charlotte nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know why she had come, only that she couldn't stop herself. There was something about him that made her feel both safe and vulnerable at the same time, a strange mix of emotions that stirred her deeply. "I don't understand you, Duke," she admitted, her eyes meeting his. "Why are you doing this for me? Why are you offering me freedom when no one else has ever given me that chance?" The Duke's expression softened, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, something real, something human. "Because, Miss Bennet," he said, standing up from his desk and walking toward her, "I've been where you are. I know what it's like to feel trapped, to feel like you have no control over your own life. And I won't let that happen to you, not while I have the power to change it." His words hung in the air, and Charlotte felt the weight of them settle deep within her. She wasn't just another woman in his life. She was someone he wanted to protect, someone he wanted to help. But why? What was it about her that made him want to go to such lengths? As he stood before her, his eyes searching hers, Charlotte felt something stir in her chest. Was this what freedom felt like? She had spent so long living in fear, living for others, that she didn't know what it meant to live for herself. But in this moment, with the Duke's words echoing in her mind, she realized that perhaps, just perhaps, she could start over. She could be more than what society had told her she was. She could be someone who mattered. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I can ever repay you for this." The Duke's gaze softened once more, and he placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture that sent a jolt of warmth through her. "You don't need to repay me, Miss Bennet," he said gently. "Just live your life the way you deserve to." Charlotte stared up at him, a feeling of hope blossoming deep inside her. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like it was hers to shape. Charlotte's world had begun to shift. Each day, as she spent more time within the Duke's estate, she felt a growing sense of freedom she had never imagined possible. The walls that had confined her for so long began to feel less like barriers and more like distant memories. She had expected nothing more than a life of silent submission, but now, she was beginning to feel like she had a say in her own future. It wasn't just the Duke's protection that made her feel free. It was his belief in her, his insistence that she was more than just a piece of property. But with that belief came new challenges. As the days passed, Charlotte found herself torn between the safety of the Duke's world and the lingering pull of her past. Her father's debts still loomed over her like a shadow, and even though she was no longer bound to them, they had left scars that were hard to ignore. One evening, after a long day spent wandering the Duke's expansive gardens, Charlotte found herself standing before the grand fireplace in the drawing room, her thoughts racing. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow over the room, but it did nothing to calm the turmoil inside her. She hadn't realized how much she missed the simplicity of her old life, the sense of certainty, even if it had been built on lies. The Duke's voice broke through her thoughts. "Miss Bennet," he said, his tone unexpectedly soft. "You've been quiet lately. Something is on your mind." She turned to face him, surprised to find him standing so close. I don't know what to do with myself, Duke," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I feel like I'm drowning in uncertainty." The Duke studied her with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "You're free now. You don't have to do anything you don't want to." Charlotte shook her head, frustration building inside her. "But I don't know what I want. I don't know how to live a life I never chose." His gaze softened, and he stepped closer, his presence steady and grounding. "Then we'll figure it out together," he said simply. Charlotte felt a wave of emotion wash over her, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to lean into it. The Duke wasn't just offering her freedom, he was offering her the chance to rebuild. She wasn't just his responsibility, she was his equal. It was a concept that felt foreign to her, but as she looked into his eyes, she began to believe it. The Duke reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "You're not alone, Charlotte," he said, his voice filled with quiet certainty. "You never will be again." His words were like a promise, one that she could almost believe in. But there was still a part of her, buried deep within, that feared trusting it. Fear had been her constant companion for so long. But as the Duke's fingers curled around hers, Charlotte realized something. Perhaps it was time to let go of the fear and embrace the unknown. Maybe, for once, she could believe in something greater than the chains of her past. Maybe, just maybe, the Duke could offer her a future worth living. And as they stood together, in the warmth of the firelight, Charlotte made a decision. She would no longer let her past define her. It was time to take the first step toward freedom. A freedom she would choose for herself. The days that followed were a whirlwind for Charlotte. She spent her mornings walking the vast gardens of the Duke's estate, her mind finally free from the constant weight of her father's debts, but still unsure of where she truly belonged. Her life had been one of survival, and now, she was standing at the edge of something she hadn't known she wanted, a life of choice. The Duke had kept his promise. He had given her freedom, but he had also given her a space to breathe, to figure out who she was beyond the chains of her past. It was a gift she wasn't sure how to accept, but it was one she was starting to understand. One evening, as the golden light of the setting sun spilled across the estate, the Duke called for her. He had never done so without a reason, and Charlotte found herself intrigued, though a small part of her still feared that this would be yet another moment where her future would be decided for her. She walked into the study, where the Duke stood by the window, looking out over the sprawling grounds. The way the light hit his face made him seem almost distant, as though he were a figure from another world. He turned as she entered, his eyes meeting hers with that familiar intensity. "Miss Bennet," he said, his voice steady but with a hint of something more behind it. "I've been thinking about your future." Charlotte felt a small knot form in her stomach. "My future?" she repeated. "Yes," the Duke said, walking toward her. "I've seen what you're capable of, and I believe you deserve more than just a life here, in the shadows of my estate. You have the strength to build your own life, if you wish." Charlotte stood there, stunned by his words. She had always been taught that her life would be shaped by others, by the whims of those with power. But here was the Duke, the man who had the power to give her everything, telling her she could choose her own path. "But how?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "How do I build a life when I've never been given the chance?" The Duke's expression softened. "You've been given the chance now, Charlotte. he said, his voice filled with conviction. You don't have to live in the shadow of your past anymore. You can step into the light and choose your own future. And I will help you, if you'll allow me. Charlotte's heart beat faster as his words sank in. She had always feared that she would be nothing more than the sum of her past, the weight of her father's debts, and her mother's silence. But here was someone who believed in her, who saw something in her that she had never allowed herself to see. For the first time, she realized that her future didn't have to be written by the past. She could write it herself. I don't know where to start, she admitted, her voice trembling. But I want to try. The Duke stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. Then we will start together. You're not alone in this, Charlotte. Not anymore. She felt a rush of emotions she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Gratitude, hope, and even a small spark of excitement. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she believed that it could be hers to shape. And as the Duke stood before her, offering her his hand, not as a master to a servant, but as an equal, Charlotte took it, ready to step into the unknown. For the first time in her life, she felt free. Charlotte awoke to the soft glow of morning light streaming through the window. It had been a week since the Duke had made his offer, and each day felt like a new beginning. She had spent those days exploring the estate, finding solace in the quiet gardens and the expansive halls, but also grappling with the enormity of the freedom the Duke had granted her. The more she thought about it, the more daunting it became. She had spent so many years living under the weight of other people's decisions, her father's debts, her place in society, that now, with the freedom to choose her own path, she didn't know where to begin. She stood before the mirror that morning, studying her reflection. The woman who stared back at her was not the same woman who had arrived at the Duke's estate, helpless and broken. No, this woman had the power to decide her future, and yet, it felt like a burden. A soft knock at the door broke her thoughts. Come in, Charlotte called, surprised to find the Duke standing in the doorway. Good morning, Miss Bennet, he said with a gentle smile, though there was something more in his eyes, a quiet understanding. I hope I'm not disturbing you. No, not at all, she replied, straightening up. I was just thinking. Thinking about the future? The Duke asked, stepping into the room. It seems that is all I do these days, Charlotte confessed with a sigh. There is so much to consider. I feel like I'm on the edge of something new, but I don't know where to start. The Duke regarded her thoughtfully, his gaze steady and reassuring. That's perfectly natural, he said. Starting over is never easy, but it's worth it. And you don't have to do it alone. Charlotte looked at him, feeling the weight of his words. But how do I know where to begin? I've never had the luxury of choice before. How do I make decisions when everything feels like it's up to me? The Duke's expression softened, and he stepped closer, placing a hand on the back of the chair beside her. You begin by trusting yourself, he said. You have already proven your strength by surviving everything that's been thrown at you. Now, you have the chance to build something for yourself. Take it one step at a time. Charlotte felt a surge of gratitude toward him. The Duke had always been kind to her, but it was more than just kindness, it was respect. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she was being controlled or manipulated. She felt like she was seen, like her voice mattered. I don't know if I'm ready, she admitted, looking away from him. None of us are ever truly ready, he replied with a smile. But you will be, when the time comes. There was a moment of silence between them, a quiet understanding passing between them. Charlotte felt her heart beat faster, not from fear, but from something else, hope. Maybe she could find her own way. Maybe, with the Duke's support, she could start over. Thank you, she said, her voice soft, for believing in me. It's not belief, Charlotte, the Duke said, his voice gentle but firm. It's knowing that you have everything you need within you. You've always had it. You just needed someone to remind you. She looked at him, meeting his eyes, and for the first time, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She had the strength to face it, and with the Duke by her side, she knew she would find her way. I'm ready, Charlotte said quietly. I'm ready to choose my own path. The Duke smiled, a warmth in his expression that made her heart flutter. Then let's take that first step together, he said. And with that, Charlotte knew that her journey had only just begun. Charlotte stood at the edge of the Duke's grand estate, her heart pounding in her chest as she gazed out over the horizon. It had been weeks since she had taken the first step toward her new life, and now, more than ever, she felt the weight of the decisions she was making. The Duke had given her the space to grow, to find herself, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the future she was building might still be fragile. It wasn't just the life she had left behind that haunted her. It was the fear of failure, of choosing the wrong path. The Duke had believed in her, but could she truly believe in herself? Miss Bennet. Charlotte's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the Duke's voice. She turned to find him walking toward her, his usual composed demeanor giving way to something softer, something more concerned. "I see you're lost in thought," he said, coming to stand beside her. "I didn't mean to disturb you." "You didn't," Charlotte replied, offering him a small smile. "I was just thinking." "About the future?" The Duke's tone was gentle, understanding. "Yes," Charlotte admitted, looking down at the ground. "I'm not sure what to do next. I've never had the freedom to make my own decisions before, and now, it feels like too much." The Duke nodded, his eyes reflecting a quiet empathy. "It can be overwhelming," he said. "But you don't have to have it all figured out right now. Life isn't a straight path, it's a series of steps, and each one leads you somewhere new." Charlotte looked up at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. The Duke had always been there for her, guiding her, supporting her, but this was different. This wasn't just about his help, it was about his belief in her. "I know," she said softly. "It's just hard to let go of the past, to trust that I can build something of my own." The Duke placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture that grounded her, his warmth spreading through her like a quiet promise. "You don't need to carry the weight of the past with you," he said, his voice firm but kind. "You've already started something new. You've already made the choice to take control of your life. That's all that matters." Charlotte felt a rush of emotion, the weight of his words sinking deep into her. She had spent so much time feeling like a victim of circumstances, but now, for the first time, she felt like she had a say in her own story. The Duke's faith in her wasn't just a gift. It was a reminder that she was capable, that she could shape her own future. She took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace settle within her. "Thank you," she whispered, turning to face him fully. "For everything." The Duke smiled, his gaze softening. "You don't have to thank me," he said quietly. "You've done this for yourself. You're the one who took the first step. Now, all that's left is to keep walking." Charlotte nodded, her heart light with a sense of clarity she hadn't known before. She didn't know where the road ahead would take her, but for the first time, she felt ready to walk it, on her own terms. The Duke was right. It wasn't about having everything figured out. It was about taking the next step, and the next, and finding the courage to move forward. As she looked up at the sky, the weight that had once held her down seemed to lift, and for the first time in years, Charlotte felt truly free. Charlotte had spent the past few weeks finding new rhythm in her life. Each day was a quiet discovery, a small step toward becoming someone she didn't recognize. She had moved from one moment to the next, taking comfort in the Duke's presence and his unwavering support. But something had begun to shift inside her. It was subtle at first, like the gentle brush of a breeze against her skin, but it was there. A growing desire to not just exist within the walls of the Duke's estate, but to truly live. It was a beautiful spring morning when Charlotte found herself once again walking through the gardens. The flowers had just begun to bloom, their colors a stark contrast to the pale gray of the past she had known. The estate felt alive with possibility, and for the first time, Charlotte began to realize that she was part of it. She had been given a chance to build something entirely of her own, but with each passing day, the weight of her past loomed just a little bit less. She was no longer tethered to the woman she had been. She wasn't the broken girl who had been sold to the Duke. She was someone new, someone who had chosen her own path. As she wandered deeper into the garden, lost in her thoughts, she suddenly heard footsteps behind her. She turned and saw the Duke walking toward her, his presence as commanding as ever. Yet, today something in the way he moved made her pause. He seemed different. Softer, perhaps. "Miss Bennet," the Duke said, his voice gentle as he reached her side. "I've been looking for you." Charlotte gave him a small smile. "I was just thinking," she replied, her voice uncertain. "About what?" he asked, his gaze searching hers with that familiar intensity. Charlotte hesitated. Could she truly explain what she was feeling? Could she put into words the shift that had taken place in her heart? "I think," I think I'm starting to understand what you meant, she began slowly. When you said I could shape my own future. I feel like I'm finally beginning to see it. What's possible? The Duke regarded her quietly, his expression unreadable. And what is possible, Miss Bennet? Charlotte took a deep breath, her heart racing. I don't know exactly, but I know I want to try. I want to live a life that's mine, not one that was forced on me. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time, she saw more than just the man who had rescued her. She saw a man who had given her the space to grow, to find herself. A man who believed in her, but also a man who had his own burdens. And that realization hit her harder than she expected. I don't want to just be someone you're helping, Duke, she said quietly. I want to stand beside you, not behind you. The Duke's eyes softened, his expression shifting. You're not behind me, Charlotte, he said, his voice low. You never have been. You've always had the strength to stand beside me. Charlotte felt the words settle deep inside her. The Duke had always seen her differently than she saw herself. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for her to start seeing herself the same way. Then, maybe it's time I start living the life I was meant to live, she said, a new sense of resolve building inside her. The Duke smiled, his eyes meeting hers with something akin to pride. I think you're already doing that, Charlotte. You just had to believe it for yourself. The garden felt different now, brighter, as though the world had opened up before her. She didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, Charlotte felt ready to face it. With the Duke beside her, she knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but it would be hers. And that, she realized, was enough. The days passed quickly, and Charlotte found herself becoming more at ease with the changes in her life. She had made her decision, and now, every moment felt like a small victory. But even in the comfort of her new life, there was an undeniable sense of uncertainty that still lingered. She had been freed from the chains of her past, but the weight of what she had left behind was never too far from her thoughts. One afternoon, Charlotte was sitting by the window, the warm sunlight pouring in, when the Duke entered the room. His presence, always commanding, seemed to fill the space, but today, there was something different in his eyes, something softer. Miss Bennet, he began, his voice gentle. I have a request. Charlotte looked up at him, surprised by the change in his tone. What is it? She asked. The Duke hesitated for a moment, as if considering his words carefully. I've been thinking about the future. Not just mine, but yours as well. Charlotte's heart skipped a beat. Was he suggesting something she wasn't ready for? She had grown accustomed to the idea of forging her own path, but the thought of her future being tied to someone else's decision still unsettled her. You've given me the space to find myself, Duke, she said quietly, but I'm not sure what you're asking of me now. The Duke stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. I'm not asking for anything, Charlotte, he said softly. I'm simply offering you a choice. I know you've been free to live your own life, but I believe there's more we can build together. Charlotte's pulse quickened. Was he proposing something she wasn't prepared to consider? Together, she repeated. What do you mean? He smiled, a hint of something more behind his expression. I mean that you don't have to do this alone. You've already proven to yourself that you have the strength to build a life, but I believe we can create something together. A future that is truly ours. Charlotte was silent for a moment, the weight of his words settling over her. She had been living in her own world, carving out a place for herself, but the idea of sharing that with someone, sharing it with him, was a thought she hadn't fully embraced. She looked at the Duke, the man who had been a constant in her life for so long, and felt a pull toward him that was impossible to ignore. I don't know if I'm ready for that, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm still figuring out who I am. The Duke nodded, his expression understanding. You don't have to be ready, Charlotte. You've already made incredible progress. All I'm offering is the chance to explore what's possible, together. Charlotte felt a mixture of fear and hope rise within her. Could she truly step into this unknown with him? Could she trust herself enough to take the next step? I want to try, she said finally, her voice steady. I want to see what we can build together. The Duke's eyes softened, and for the first time, Charlotte saw not just the man of power and authority, but the man who had given her the freedom to choose. Then let's take that step, Charlotte, he said quietly, his voice filled with a quiet determination. And in that moment, Charlotte knew that whatever the future held, she was ready to face it, with him by her side. The days that followed were filled with change. Charlotte had taken the first step toward a future she never thought possible, and now she was ready to take another. The Duke had become more than just her protector. He was her partner in every sense of the word. The decision to build something together felt like the right one, yet there was still a quiet unease within her. Could she truly let go of the fear that had held her back for so long? One afternoon, as the two of them walked through the estate's lush gardens, Charlotte found herself beside him, her hand brushing against his. It was a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes. She had never been one to let anyone in, yet here she was, slowly opening her heart to him. "Charlotte," the Duke said, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. "I want you to know that this partnership means more to me than you realize." She turned to face him, meeting his gaze. His eyes were steady, full of sincerity, and for the first time, she saw the weight of the past few weeks reflected in them. "I'm not just offering you a future," he continued. "I'm offering you a chance to build that future with me, on your own terms. No expectations, no obligations. Just us, deciding together." Charlotte felt the pressure of his words. She had always believed that freedom came with its own set of rules, rules she had been taught to follow. But the Duke's offer was different. He wasn't asking her to fit into a mold. He was asking her to be herself. "And what if I don't know what I want?" she asked softly. "What if I'm still figuring it out?" The Duke smiled, his expression softening. "Then we'll figure it out together," he said, the warmth in his voice making her heart flutter. "No rush. No need to have it all figured out today. What matters is that we're both willing to take the journey." Charlotte looked up at him, her heart racing as she felt something shift within her. The past few weeks had shown her that she wasn't as alone as she had always felt. The Duke had been her rock, but he had also been her guide, helping her see the potential within herself. And now, standing beside him, she realized that for the first time in her life, she didn't have to do it alone. "I think," Charlotte began, her voice trembling slightly. "I think I want to try. I want to see where this takes us. Together." The Duke's eyes softened with a mixture of relief and happiness. "You don't have to be afraid of what comes next, Charlotte. We're in this together. And whatever happens, we'll face it side by side." Charlotte smiled, a weight lifting from her chest as she felt the truth of his words settle deep within her. For the first time in her life, she was ready to embrace the unknown. She had always feared what lay ahead, but now, with the Duke by her side, she realized that the future wasn't something to fear, it was something to build. "Together," she whispered, feeling the word in her heart. And in that moment, Charlotte knew that whatever the future held, she was no longer afraid to face it. With the Duke, she had found the courage to move forward, not just for herself, but for them both. The days grew warmer, and with each passing one, Charlotte found herself growing stronger. The Duke's presence in her life had given her more than she ever thought she could have: hope, freedom, and a sense of self she had long forgotten. But there was one thing that still lingered in the back of her mind: the world outside the Duke's estate. Her past, her family, and the reality that still waited for her beyond the safety of these walls. One evening, as she stood by the window, looking out over the sprawling gardens, Charlotte's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the Duke's voice behind her. "Miss Bennet," he said, his tone soft yet urgent. She turned to face him, her heart quickening at the sight of him standing in the doorway. "There's something we need to discuss," he continued, his expression serious. Charlotte's pulse raced as she took a step closer. "What is it?" she asked, her voice betraying the anxiety she felt rising within her. The Duke hesitated, then closed the distance between them. "I've been thinking a lot about the future, Charlotte," he said, his eyes searching hers. "Our future." Charlotte swallowed hard. They had both spoken about a future together, but now, as the weight of his words settled into the air between them, she realized that he was asking for something more. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The Duke took her hands gently in his touch warm and steady. "I want you to know that. You are not alone in this," he said. "But there are challenges ahead, challenges that we will face together." Charlotte felt a surge of uncertainty. "What challenges?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The world outside this estate," he said. "You know that I've offered you the freedom to choose your own path, but there are still people who will never accept that. People who see you as a pawn, not as the woman you are." The reality of the situation hit her like a cold wave. She had always feared the world outside, the judgment, the expectations. But with the Duke by her side, she had begun to believe that she could overcome it. "And what if I'm not strong enough?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "You are stronger than you think," the Duke replied, his voice unwavering. "But we will face this together. Whatever comes, we will face it side by side." Charlotte looked at him, her heart full of gratitude and fear. She had come so far from the girl she once was, but the thought of stepping into the unknown, even with the Duke beside her, still felt overwhelming. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted, her voice shaky. The Duke's eyes softened with understanding. "You don't have to do it alone," he said gently. "I'm here. Always." The words echoed in Charlotte's mind, and for the first time, she felt something solid within her. She had never been alone, not truly. The Duke had shown her that she was worth more than the circumstances of her past. She could face the world, not with fear, but with the strength she had found in herself. "Then, let's face it together," Charlotte said, her voice growing stronger. The Duke smiled, the weight of their shared understanding passing between them. "Together," he agreed, squeezing her hands gently. In that moment, Charlotte realized that the future was no longer something to fear. It was something they would shape, together. And with the Duke by her side, she knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she would not face them alone. The Duke's words had settled deep in Charlotte's heart, and as the days passed, she found herself contemplating the future with a new sense of purpose. There was no longer uncertainty about what lay ahead. There was only the question of how to approach it. The bond between her and the Duke had only grown stronger, and with each passing moment, Charlotte realized how much she had changed. No longer was she the girl who had been sold to pay debts. No longer was she the one who had been bound by expectations and obligations. She had begun to see herself as more than just a woman caught in the whims of others. She had begun to see herself as an equal to the Duke, someone with the power to shape her own destiny. But even with this newfound strength, there was still one thing she could not ignore: the world beyond the Duke's estate. Though she had grown accustomed to her life here, Charlotte knew that eventually they would have to face the consequences of her past. Her father's debts, her family's reputation, these things still haunted her, waiting to catch up with her. One afternoon, as she sat by the window, the sunlight streaming through the glass, Charlotte felt a familiar weight in her chest. The Duke had given her everything, but could he truly protect her from the world outside? Could they face everything together, or would the shadows of her past tear them apart? Just as these thoughts threatened to consume her, the Duke entered the room. His presence, always steady and commanding, seemed to fill the space, and for a moment, Charlotte found herself lost in the comfort of it. "You're deep in thought again, Miss Bennet," he said gently, his voice warm but laced with concern. Charlotte smiled faintly, trying to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. "I'm just thinking about the future." The Duke approached her, his eyes soft with understanding. "I know it's been difficult," he said, his voice steady. "But you don't have to face any of this alone. Whatever comes, we will face it together." Charlotte felt a flicker of gratitude. The Duke had always been her anchor, the one constant in a life that had felt like an endless storm. But this time, the storm wasn't just the uncertainty of her past. It was the reality of what they would have to confront. "I know," Charlotte said quietly, her voice betraying the doubt she couldn't quite shake. "But what if? What if the past catches up with me? What if we can't outrun it?" The Duke knelt beside her, taking her hand in his. His grip was firm, reassuring. "We don't have to outrun it, Charlotte," he said softly. "We face it head on, and we do it together, just as we always have." Charlotte's heart swelled with emotion. She had always feared the weight of her past, but here, in the presence of the Duke, she realized that she didn't have to carry it alone. For the first time, she saw that facing the future wasn't about avoiding what had happened. It was about embracing what was to come. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I would do without you." The Duke's eyes softened, and he smiled gently. "You've never been without me, Charlotte, and you never will be." In that moment, Charlotte knew that no matter what challenges awaited them, they would face them as one. She had found her strength, not in isolation, but in the partnership she had forged with the Duke. And with him by her side, she felt ready to face whatever the future held. The days turned into weeks, and Charlotte felt herself gradually settling into this new life she had begun to build. She had embraced the future with open arms, no longer weighed down by the ghosts of her past. The Duke had been her strength, her guide, and together, they had created something meaningful. Yet, despite the calm that had settled over their lives, there was always a lingering sense of something more. The shadows of her past were never far from her thoughts, and though the Duke had promised to face whatever came their way together, Charlotte knew that some challenges were inevitable. One morning, as she walked through the halls of the estate, a messenger arrived with a letter bearing the seal of her family. Her heart sank. She had been avoiding any news from her past, but now it seemed that it had caught up with her. The letter was from her father's estate, and the contents were not something she had been prepared to read. It was a demand for repayment, an ultimatum. Her family had once again tied her to their debts, and there was no escaping it. She stood in the doorway, staring at the letter in her hands, feeling the weight of everything she had tried to leave behind. Just then, the Duke appeared in the hallway, his presence calming as always. He saw the letter in her hand, and immediately sensed the shift in the air. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Charlotte hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to explain the flood of emotions that had overtaken her. "It's from my father," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "They want the money. The debts haven't been forgiven." The Duke's expression darkened, but his gaze remained steady. "You've come so far, Charlotte," he said softly, stepping closer. "But that doesn't mean you have to face this alone. We'll handle it together." Charlotte looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had always feared her past would catch up with her, but in this moment, with the Duke by her side, she realized that no matter what happened, she would not face it alone. "I don't know what to do," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "They expect me to pay, to fix everything." The Duke took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "And you will," he said, his voice steady. "But you don't have to do it alone. You never have to carry this burden by yourself again." Charlotte felt a tear slip down her cheek, but this time, it was different. It wasn't a tear of fear or defeat. It was a tear of relief. The Duke was right. She had carried so much for so long, but now, with him by her side, she didn't have to bear it all alone. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." The Duke smiled, his expression warm and genuine. "We'll face this, Charlotte. Whatever it is, we'll face it together." In that moment, Charlotte knew that whatever challenges the future held, she was no longer alone. She had the Duke's unwavering support, and with that, she had everything she needed to overcome whatever came their way. No matter the cost, they would face it together, side by side.